In the beginning of this video, there was darkness, when suddenly, a dog! So my friend sent me this picture and asked me for help in making her photography of her dog better. And she wasn't happy with this picture. And so I took the picture, I looked at the data, and noticed that she had her camera in automatic mode. And she really wanted to get out of automatic mode and understand how her camera works better. So if you are stuck in automatic mode on your camera and you want more control over your photography, then stick around. This video might be for you. You might not understand what these things mean yet, and if you don't, awesome, because we're gonna cover shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO. Automatic mode in her camera chose a very fast shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. It chose a medium f-stop of 5.6 and an ISO all the way at the bottom as low as it can go at 100. If you don't know what that means, stick around, because by the end of this video you will. I'm going to break you out of that automatic mode. We're going to go into full manual mode, and you're going to take more control of your photography than ever before. In the meantime, I don't want my friend to feel bad for using auto mode or feel like she has a bad camera or that she's a bad photographer. So I replicated her photo in my home studio. I don't have snow living in Houston, but I do have a big white piece of paper, and I have a stone rhino. So here is my stone rhino on his field of snow. He's a snow rhino. And so we've got a white background with a dark subject, and I put my camera in auto mode. My auto mode chose a shutter speed of 150, f-stop of 3.2, and again ISO all the way down at 100. This photo is pretty darn underwhelming, isn't it? One thing that her camera did better than mine was showing the snow as actually being white. See how nice and white that snow is? Automatic mode very frequently will give you gray looking snow, and people are like, oh, the snow looks so dirty, it looks so drab. It's not your fault. It's that auto mode gets it wrong. So let's get rid of automatic mode, let's figure out how to switch to manual, and let's take control of our camera. So I looked up what kind of camera my friend has, and she's running a Canon EOS. Here you can see I did a screenshot of the user manual on the left and a kind of a photoshopped photo of the top of the camera on the right. Now, of course, every camera has its own different versions of a user interface. They all have their own user manual that you can look up how to do this stuff, and they all have their own fans on YouTube. So you can go to YouTube and just type in the model of camera that you have, and there will be tutorials of friendly people who are helping you understand how to make adjustments to your camera settings. We're not going to go deep into that, but I want to say in general, you can see that there's this basic zone on most SLRs where you have a scene mode, an automatic plus mode. That's where your auto mode's at. There's sport and landscape and portrait and still life, and they kind of market these as, you know, the sort of magic solution. Like, oh, if you're taking sports photography, you set it to the sport mode. Well, all sport mode really is that they had some employees who are professional photographers, and they had a bunch of meetings, and they decided what settings between shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO, what settings are the best for sport photography. Okay, we're going to preload those into the camera, and we're going to bias it towards those settings to give the photographer the best possible chance of having success if they don't know how to do manual mode. That's all there is to it. The camera doesn't magically know that you are taking a sports photo. It's just you've kind of cheated and biased your settings in that direction. It's still not as good as a basic fundamental understanding of what shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO are. We're going to skip all that stuff. We're not going to use the part that I highlighted in red at all. We're going to go straight to manual, which is the part that I highlighted in green, and you're going to feel a lot better. Let's skip all these marketing modes and go straight to full and direct control of our camera settings. It's not going to be that hard, I promise. So I've got one more screenshot from the user manual here on the left, and you can see I've highlighted in green how on this particular camera you set the shutter speed and you set the aperture, and then above that you can see you have to turn to page 122 to set the ISO. I'm just going to call it ISO. I think that's how most people say it. So let's start about talking about aperture. the reason I want to start with aperture is because when photographers talk about exposure, they usually talk in terms of f-stop. I overexposed that shot by 2 stops, or I underexposed that shot by a stop. And what they mean is that there's all these different f-stops in your lens. Different lenses have different f-stops that they can do, and they're on a numbering system. So you can see on the right, I've pressed and held down the shutter on my camera so you can see what happens to the diaphragm and the lens when I actually take the shot. At f4, there's a big hole there. There's a lot of light that goes through that big hole to hit the sensor. And at f22, it's closed up all the way. 22 is the highest number that particular lens can do, and so it's letting in the smallest amount of light possible. So f22 will be the darkest exposure possible with that lens if everything else is the same, and f4 will be a much brighter exposure because more light's coming through and it's hitting the sensor of the camera. So if we want to make our photo brighter, we set our f-stop to a larger aperture and a lower number, like f4. If we want to make our photo darker, then we set it to a small aperture with a large f-stop number, like f22. Super easy. How hard could it be? End of video, right? No, not the end of the video. There's more to think about. There is something called depth of field, and it matters a lot when you are shooting subjects that are relatively close to you, and you have to choose what you're going to do with your aperture. This is part of where the artistry of photography comes in. Understanding the relationship between your f-stop and your depth of field can make you turn ordinary photos into amazing photos. So here's how it works. At f22, all the light is being focused through a very, very small, almost a pinhole area, right? And I don't know why this is, because I don't have a degree in optical engineering, but that means your depth of field is very long. So things that are close to the camera will be in focus, and things that are far away from the camera will also be in focus. And everything in between will be in focus. So f22, that f22 setting gives me the greatest amount of depth of field possible. As I decrease the number on the f-stop and I make my aperture bigger, depth of field decreases significantly. So what does this look like? Well, I took photos so I can show you. Here is a chessboard on my table, and I've set my f-stop to 22, all right? And you'll notice to get enough light into the camera with my f-stop at 22, indoors, even with my little constant on lights that I used, I had to set my shutter speed at an extremely low setting. So my shutter speed is actually 0.6 seconds. It's over a half a second for the shutter to be open to get the correct exposure that I wanted. Here's where having a tripod will help you. There's no way that I could have taken this shot handheld. I did it off the tripod and setting my camera to a 2-second timer. Again, look at your manual and figure out how to do that. It's super handy. So I push the button, I take my hand off the camera, 2 seconds later, clack, clack, the shutter goes. And that means that nothing moved. The only thing that moved was the mirror inside the digital SLR camera, and so I got a nice sharp image that's not blurred because I was trying to hold the thing by hand and mash down on that shutter button. So when I'm at f22 and I'm looking at my chessboard here, we can see that the whole chessboard is in focus. All the way to the rooks at the end, we've got our knights, we've got our bishop, and our king and our queen. Everybody's in focus. The entire board is in focus. I love this chessboard. I bought this chess set in Bayeux, France in 2019. It depicts the Battle of Agincourt. So let's move our f-stop down. We're going to change our other settings to where my exposure is the same, but I'm going to move my f-stop down to f8. Now my shutter speed is 0.3 seconds, so I've cut my shutter speed in half from what it was, dropped my ISO down to 100, and now I'm at f8 instead of f22. And look at what's happened on the edges where the rooks are and the knights are, all of a sudden they're a little fuzzy. They're not really in focus anymore. So I've lost that depth of field. I don't have the very close thing or the very far away thing in focus anymore at f8. Let's go to f4.0. This is the one that was on the top of my diagram a minute ago. So here we are, my shutter's now at 1/13 of a second. I'm at f4, and even the queen is not really in focus at this stage. I've got the king in focus, and one of the bishops is in focus, and that's about it. Everything else being equal and my exposure being about the same, by changing my aperture, I've changed my depth of field drastically. Now this particular lens is fairly extreme in aperture, and it goes all the way to f1.8, which is really cool. That allows a ton of light into the camera, but it also creates an extremely short depth of field when you're shooting something that's up close, and it looks like this. So f1.8, you can see really only the king's head and maybe his sword and his hand on his sword. Those are the only things that are truly in focus. And that might be an artistic choice. Maybe, I'm making a book about chess, and I want to emphasize the importance of this one piece on the chessboard, and I want to show the detail of this one piece and how beautifully made it is, and I don't want the distraction of all the other pieces there being in focus. And so for artistic purposes, I deliberately choose f1.8 to make my king the focal point of this composition, right? It all depends on what I want to do, what I emphasize, and how I work my camera. I can go all the way to 1.8, or I can go back to f22 and have the whole thing in focus. It depends on what I want. But I have that level of control over my composition now because I understand aperture. And that's something that automatic mode could never give you. So now that we understand aperture, I want to talk a little bit more about shutter speed. Let's transition to shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of my favorite things to play with these cameras, and you can be very artistic with it, and it all depends on what you're trying to do, what you're trying to capture, what you're trying to see, and it's a very easy way to change your exposure level without a lot of harmful side effects until you get to the extremes. And of course, I'm going to show you the extremes. Now, one thing I want to bring up is that you can do practice shoots with a digital camera. It doesn't really cost you anything. In the old days, we had to buy rolls of 35mm film, and each roll cost money, and then you had to pay to get them processed, and you didn't know if your shots were any good or not until you'd paid the money to have the photo processor print them out into little 4x6 prints or whatever. And all those days are thankfully gone, and now I can take 1,000 photos in my camera and just play with settings and just experiment and see what I get. It doesn't really cost me anything. So I encourage you, Mr. and Mrs. Faithful Viewer here, to play with your camera and take a lot of photos and experiment with shutter speed and just see what you get. Because there is a bit of a learning curve to it, and I think it's an awful lot of fun. So here's an example of me just playing with shutter speeds and seeing what I get. So it's a T6 Texan warming up to go fly at an air show, and you can see that I've kind of gone to an extreme on shutter speed here. My f-stop is all the way down at f22, so it's letting in the minimum amount of light possible into my lens. And ISO is also all the way at the bottom at 100, so it's also the darkest setting that's possible for ISO. And then, so to compensate for that and to get a decent exposure that's properly exposed, I have to crank my shutter speed all the way down to 1/50th of a second, which is really slow. If I get much slower than 1/50th of a second, I start getting motion blur from me just holding the camera and hitting the shutter button. So 1/50th is about as slow as I can reasonably go handheld and still get a sharp image. But you'll notice, as a consequence of the super slow shutter speed, this plane appears to have basically no propeller. It just looks like a little spinny, whirly blob in front of the nose of the plane, and you don't really see the propellers at all because they were moving so fast that the shutter was open for a long enough amount of time that the propeller moved so much that you could actually see daylight behind it. The camera recorded all of the daylight behind the propeller instead of just recording the propeller being there. So this isn't really a very good photo because it's a little bit confusing. How come there's no propeller on the end of this airplane? So let's bump our shutter speed up a little bit. We'll bump it up to f. A shutter is 1/400th of a second now. So in 1/400th of a second, you can see some blur, some motion blur from the propeller. And I kind of like this because it gives you an idea of that the engine is turned on and that there's motion happening, that the thing is coming to life. And we can see that the guy's standing by there with his little fire extinguisher in case the engine catches fire. And now we know why he's there, because the engine's kind of running. And it kind of clues us into what the story of the picture is. And so this would be a setting that I would like for a shot like this. And you can see how much motion blur there is with the shutter at 1/400th of a second. If I change it to where my shutter speed is a lot faster, and the shutter opens and closes in just 1/2500th of 1 second, you'll notice I had to change my f-stop to keep my exposure correct. But now the engine's still running, but it doesn't look like it is. If you zoom in and you're seeing this on like a PC and you can full screen the YouTube video, then you'll be able to see a tiny bit of motion blur on that propeller, but not enough to really tell the story. Now it kind of looks like the airplane's just sitting there with two guys in the cockpit playing pretend, and the engine isn't running at all. So I have two kind of bad shots here. I have my no propeller at all shot with my shutter speed too slow, and I have my plane sitting still shot with my shutter speed too fast, when what I really want is my engine running with some propeller blur shot. Let me give you another example of this. So I was at an air show in 2010, and they do these heritage flights. I really like to do the heritage flight photos. So here is 2010. It's an A-10 Thunderbolt and a P-38 Lightning on a cloudy day, and what an awesome shot this is. Great lighting, cool clouds in the background, love it. Except I had my shutter speed set to 1/3000th of a second, which is about as fast as my camera then would go. And the reason I had it set that fast was because I didn't want any motion blur as I was tracking these planes across the skies. They flew from left to right. I didn't want them to be all blurry. I wanted to get really crisp images. So I set my shutter speed all the way up. Kind of a newbie mistake, to be honest. And what I got was a bunch of photos that look like this one, where they kind of look like scale models hanging from the ceiling. There's no propeller blur on that P-38 Lightning. It looks kind of like CGI. It looks like a Hollywood deal or a computer rendering. It doesn't look like a photograph of a real flying plane to me. It sort of has an uncanny valley, otherworldly appearance of, why is this airplane hanging in the air without the propellers turning? So even though technically the shot is what I wanted, I still had an unintended consequence of that high shutter speed, and I wound up really not liking the shots of propeller planes from that air show at all. So I learned my lesson. Fast forward a decade, and in 2022 I took photos of another heritage flight, and here's a P-51 and an F-16. Yay! And you can see now I've set my shutter to 1/800th of a second, and I'm much more experienced at this now. So I've realized that at 1/800th of a second, I am getting both planes really sharp. They're not blurry from the motion of going left to right in front of my camera. I can pan with the planes, and I can click off a series of shots, and the planes will be they'll be caught nicely by my camera and not fuzzy. But what is blurring is the motion of that propeller at 1/800th of a second. And now it looks like my P-51 is a real P-51. It's not a scale model of a Mustang hanging from the ceiling. It's a real plane flying in close formation with that jet. and you can see the pilot's head in there as they look at each other, making sure that they're keeping their spacing together. And I really like this composition much more better. So I'll give you one more look. That's 1/3000th of a second and 1/800th of a second. So with shutter speed, both of these shots were exposed correctly. They're not overexposed or underexposed, but by changing my shutter speed, I can tweak a small detail in my airshow photography, which I personally think is kind of important. Now that we've got a handle on shutter speed, it's time to move on to our last setting, which is ISO. I'm going to return to my crappy auto Rhino photo here with the gray paper. And automatic mode decided ISO needed to be all the way at the bottom at 100. But if I increase my ISO, I can, if I go to 250 and mess around with my other settings a little bit, I have white paper now instead of gray paper. If I go to ISO 400 and lower my shutter speed and play around with my f-stop, I have full depth of field, so the entire Rhino's in focus, and I've got a good amount of detail, and like this composition's getting a lot better here. If I go all the way up to the highest that my camera will go and artificially boost my ISO beyond what is normal, I can go all the way to ISO 25,600, which is insane. Have a great shutter speed and a very small aperture, but you can see that I have lost a lot of detail. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more here. So here's a picture of my friend Julia, and this is a studio shot of her. I've got studio lighting here, so my shutter speed is mediocre. There's nothing special about that. I'm at f2.2 because I want pretty much everything blown out except for her face. I don't care about the chair, I don't care about a shirt, I don't even care if most of her hair is not in focus. I want those big brown eyes and her nose and her mouth to be in focus, so your eye gets drawn to that and you go, damn, what a pretty girl Julia is. If I zoom in on just her eye, you can see how much detail I get at ISO 200. So why would automatic mode choose ISO 100 when there's not enough light for the camera? I don't know, I don't get it. But even at ISO 200, which is twice as much light coming into the camera, we can see every eyelash, and we can see the pores in her skin. We can see everything in tremendous detail at just ISO 200. What happens if I increase my ISO by a factor of 10 and go from ISO 200 to ISO 2000? Well, I've done that. I was in Vegas and I had to go to ISO 2000 because I wanted to take a picture of the flaming volcano in front of the Mirage Hotel. I didn't have a tripod with me, so I had to boost my shutter speed up enough to where I could hold the camera still and get not a lot of motion blur. I wanted to get a good crisp shot, and I also didn't want to have no depth of field. I needed at least a little bit of depth of field, even though my subject was far away. So I went to f3.2, which by itself was pretty risky, about as wide open as I dared, and then I still didn't have enough light to get into the camera. So I went to ISO 2000, which looks pretty decent when you see the shot overall. But look what happens when I zoom in the way that I did with Julia's eye. You can see that the flame unit on top of the volcano there, it's pretty much like the same thing they use in hot air balloons. But look at all the noise, almost like dust. It's almost like grain, and it's a distortion that you get when you crank the ISO up too high. And that's the price you pay when you boost ISO. It's not that big a deal in the digital world. Again, this is not a terrible photo. It's not a super grainy photo. It's only obvious when I zoom in. But if I zoom in and I compare ISO 2000 to ISO 200, you can see the effect in terms of the quality of your image of increasing ISO. Now, to talk more about ISO and to talk about balancing these three aspects of your digital camera, I'm going to ask a very special guest to come on to my YouTube video, and that special guest is myself. So conceptually, the way I like to think about it is that my camera is always thirsty for light. I'm trying to hydrate my camera with as much light as I can. Now, if it's a bright, sunshiny day and it's noon and the sun's directly above me and there's no clouds in the sky, or if I have a lot of studio lighting like I do right now, then I have plenty of water to go around. if the sun is going down and it's the golden hour, it's sunset, and I'm trying to take some good sunset photography, or if I have special circumstances, I'm trying to take action photography or something like that, then I don't have enough water to go around, and I have to carefully choose whether I'm going to put the amount of light or water, my analogy. I need to choose how much do I want to put in ISO, how much do I want to put in shutter speed, how much do I want to put in my f-stop. And that's really where a lot of the artistry of photography happens. That's kind of the hard part. Also, the fun and entertaining part is to learn in manual mode to manipulate these three settings. So, what's going on here? ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Pretty exciting, huh? Until 1974, there were competing ways of measuring a camera's sensitivity to light, or a film's sensitivity to light, and those were standardized in 1974. And so, because they were standardized and everybody agreed we're going to use the same method, that became ISO, the standard of how your camera or your film is sensitive to light. Of course, we're talking about shooting digitally, so we don't have to worry about buying film that's labeled ISO 100 or ISO 400. Back in the old days, you had to buy a roll of film and it was all the same ISO, and you'd have to shoot all those exposures with the same ISO. You had no control over it, and you were down just to shutter speed and f-stop for the duration of that roll of film. Now with digital, we can change it on the fly. We can basically add more light to this big bin anytime we want to by increasing the ISO on our digital camera. So we live in a very exciting time for photography, where we can basically go to the sink and fill this up anytime we want to. But here's the trick. When you increase the ISO number, the default is usually 100. As you raise that up, every time you double the number, you double the exposure of the shot. So if my default is ISO 100 and I change it to ISO 200, if I leave everything else exactly the same, my shot will be twice as bright at ISO 200 as it was at ISO 100. And then from ISO 200, if I change it to ISO 400, my ISO 400 shot is twice as bright as ISO 200. And ISO 800 would be twice as bright as the ISO 400. You get where I'm going with this. You run out of opportunity more quickly than you'd think. What's happening is that you're increasing, it's not really increasing the sensor's sensitivity to light. The sensor has a certain sensitivity to light that is built into that sensor with however good it is, whatever the technology they could squeeze into it. But what you're doing is you are, with your shutter speed and your f-stop and everything else, your sensor only has a certain amount of time to record the light that enters into each pixel in that sensor. And increasing the ISO is kind of amplifying that signal. And as the signal gets amplified, it gets a little bit distorted. And that results in noise. So by the time we get to like ISO 1000, we're starting to see a significantly more noisy shot than we were before. By the time we get to ISO 6400, which is usually the highest that your camera will go, you're talking about a very, very grainy image that's not going to be really suitable for printing out into a big poster or any kind of like large format presentation, because people will be able to see how noisy and grainy it is. But sometimes you have no choice. If you're trying to take action photos of birds flying at sunset and you want to actually see the sharpness of the birds, you're going to have to crank ISO up pretty high, because you have to get the birds in focus with some sort of depth of field with your f-stop, and you have to get them sharp with some shutter speed. So so these are the three things that we're trying to balance out here, right? So let's say I'm taking airshow photos, my favorite, right? So I've got an airplane and it's up against a clear blue sky, so I don't really need that much depth of field here, but I want a lot of shutter speed because I want that airplane to be crisp. Airplanes are moving really fast. I'm trying to pan as fast as I can as the airplane passes by the crowd, and I'm shooting on bursts, and I'm trying to basically just get that perfect shot where I panned and I caught the airplane very smoothly, and I had a fast shutter speed, and I caught something cool. You know, contrails or the afterburner coming out, or something that is compelling to me. So if I'm doing airshow photography, I'm going to take the amount of light that I've got, and I'm going to pour a lot of it into my shutter speed, right? I want a lot of shutter speed. Awesome. So now I can get that sharp and crisp shutter speed, you know, real fast. 1/2000th of a second, 1/3000th of a second. Super fast shutter speed, right? But guess what I did? I didn't leave myself very much water for f-stop. Nope, that's all I get, right? So in that circumstance, it's not a big deal. I don't need a lot of depth of field. I just want the airplane to be in focus. But turn these around so you can see. Here in this situation, I've chosen a ton of shutter speed, and I've chosen not very much f-stop. And for airshow photography, that's my solution. That's what I want to do, and I'm happy with that. Let's try another one. Back into ISO it goes. Let's say I am taking a picture of the Rocky Mountains at sunset. Awesome. Guess what? Rocky Mountains don't move. So I don't need much shutter speed at all. I can have like a really slow shutter speed. 1/30th of a second if I've got a tripod. If I don't have a tripod, usually about 1/60th of a second is the slowest that I can go with shutter speed and still hold my camera still. If I go below 1/60th, what I wind up with is a lot of user-induced movement, where I'm trying to hold my camera still and it's going ka-clack, 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 ka-clack. But I wind up with a bunch of blurry images because I'm breathing and I'm moving, and the mirror in the camera is moving, so I get mirror shake. Really, to go under 1/60th of a second, I like to have it on a tripod like it is right now taking this video. So I just need a little bit. I'm just going to do a little bit of shutter speed, 1/60th of a second, so I don't get any blur from me holding the camera or from the mirror moving inside my digital SLR. Which means I can use a lot of f-stop, because I want everything in focus. I want the mountains in focus, I want the trees in focus, I want the little house that's down at the bottom of the mountain in focus. I want everything in focus, right? So for that situation, I chose a ton of f-stop, a very high f-stop number like f18 or f20 even, and I've taken all my light and I poured it into f-stop. So my shutter speed is really poor. It's really low. The shutter's going to be open for a really long time, and that's how I portioned out my available light. Again, I can go back to the kitchen sink basically, and I can get more light by cranking up my ISO. But if I do that, if I want both f-stop and I want shutter speed at the same time, and I don't have a ton of light to work with, I'm going to have to settle for a noisy image. Now, what if I just can wave my magic wand and I want all of these three to be as full as they possibly can? I want as much light as I possibly can getting into that camera, where I can have an awesome shutter speed, an awesome f-stop, awesome ISO. I want it all. Well, guess what? You can do that. All it takes is cubic amounts of money. And that is why when you go on, you know, the websites, and you're on Adorama, or you're on, you know, lensrental.com and those kind of places, and you're looking at what some of these pro photography lenses and cameras cost, you know, you realize that a lens that has a lot of zoom, that goes to 400 millimeters of zoom, but also has a super low f-stop of, say, f2.8, so it can gather in a ton of light, all of a sudden, instead of a $800 or $900 lens, all of a sudden you're looking at a $4,000 lens. Why would anybody pay that? Well, because they want it all. You know, why would anybody buy a $10,000 camera body from Sony? Because they want all of these things. And even then, there are sacrifices to be made. Even then, you have to juggle ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. But cubic amounts of money can help make this less difficult. For most of us mere mortals that aren't doing that sort of thing, a lot of our photography in terms of fiddling with our settings is going to be figuring out how can I keep my ISO as low as possible and then balance out what's left between my shutter speed and my f-stop. Cheers. We're getting closer to the end of the video now, but I wanted to go back to our original pic of the dog that my friend sent me and put it in Photoshop and see if I can rescue it, because sometimes our shots are not as bad as we think, and there's a whole other skill level involved in post-processing, and sometimes what you see or get straight out of the camera is not all that you have. Photoshop and photo image manipulation is arguably beyond the scope of this video, but I wanted to at least go through my process on how I would optimize this shot. I turned the shot from this into this, just with 5 minutes of photoshopping, which I happened to capture. So I'm going to show you that, so anybody who's interested in Photoshop can see some of my tricks. And then I'm going to show you some pictures that I took of my dogs walking at a local park and the settings that I used, and then that'll be it for the video. Okay, so let's see if we can actually salvage the original dog pic. Even as underexposed as it is, Photoshop is magic, so let's try to work a little bit of Photoshop magic. The dog is a little bit small and a little bit far away because my friend did not have a zoom lens. So let's keep the original ratio and let's just crop a lot of the background and stuff out of there. We will keep the dog. Let's make the dog kind of in the right hand corner. I like to use the rule of thirds. So these corners here are a third of the way across, and the eye likes it when we put our subject in one of these areas. So let's put the dog here because the dog is running this way. So let's give the dog some space to run into. If you compose it to where the dog is doing this and running out of the frame, it's a really weird feeling compositionally. So I'm not reinventing the wheel here. We're going to use rule of thirds, and that's our doggo running in a snowy field. Alright, this is a very high resolution camera. We can see that there's actually a lot of detail that's been gathered. So our snow is a little bit gray because we were unexposed. We're going to go to image, adjustments, exposure, and let's just try cranking the exposure up a little bit. Say, 3/4, right? It's 0.76 of a stop. These numbers indicate f-stop. So if you had used one f-stop different to overexpose more, you'd be about there. Obviously now our snow is totally blown out. It's completely white, completely unacceptable. It doesn't look realistic. And honestly, we haven't really gotten a lot more detail out of our dog. A little bit, but not enough to compensate for the disaster that we made of the rest of the competition. So just a basic exposure adjustment is not going to work for us. So we're going to have to go into curves. Curves are a little bit advanced. They're a little bit hard to read and understand. But what I want to show you here is, alright, so this is all of the channels together, red, green, and blue, all at the same time. And it's the amount of light in the composition. So this is dark to light, and this is dark to light. And I'm not really clear on the difference between input and output, but what we're seeing here is that this is the dog. There's a very small amount of black in this composition, right? And then this is our snow on the light end. If we move this little cursor here to cut off the computer reading the extra whiteness, so when we compensate for it, watch what happens. We get right back to where we were, because now what it is that this is maximum whiteness on the level here. So we're not going to do that. What we want to do is we want to change this curve so that we see more detail on the dog without getting rid of the detail on the snow. So I'm going to grab this line here and I'm going to curve it. It's not curved yet. and I'm going to curve it to where I like what I see with the dog. There we go. That's a good amount of detail on our happy doggo. And then I'm going to grab it about in the middle, and I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Maybe about like that. I want the snow a little bit brighter, but not too much. I don't want gray snow. I want white snow, but I still want details. And I just want a little bit more out of the darkness of that dog. I think right about there is going to do it for us. So I've adjusted this curve. I grant you this is pretty advanced stuff, but what you can see what I've done is I've raised the dark portion of the composition without raising the bright portion of the composition too much. That's why it's better than just moving that exposure slider. This took me a long time to figure out. I'm going to hit OK. Now I'm going to zoom in and show you the kind of detail that her camera really caught on the dog. And it's really very impressive. We're now at 100% size. So this is straight out of the camera. This is what the camera saw. Even though our shutter speed was 1/2000, it caught a lot of detail. You can see the snow here is flaking. There's not a lot of motion blur in the paws. It's really quite excellent. And then if I want to cheat it a little bit more, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my sharpen tool, and we're going to just sharpen the doggo. We're not going to sharpen the whole composition. I'm just going to hold the sharpen tool over the part of the dog that we are the most interested in. If you overdo it on this, it gets really noisy, like you were using too much ISO. There we go. I used the sharpen tool twice, and we've got a lot more detail on the dog. I'm going to zoom back out so you don't even notice it that much. Let's crop it a little bit more because it's so good. It's so good we can get away with even more of a crop. Boom. All right. Now let's see what our resolution is at this point. Our image size is still amazingly 2,794 pixels wide, which is big enough that Facebook will freak out and turn your image size into a potato. So what I always do is I change whether it's the width or the height, depending on whether I'm shooting in landscape or if I'm shooting in portrait mode, vertically. Whichever one of these is the bigger number, I change it to 2048. 2048 is the natural resolution of Facebook and will cause Facebook to not recompress the image and make your pictures look as good as they possibly can. And I'm going to save the image like that, and that is my rescued image from my friend, showing her that her camera really is good and she really did take a really good picture. It just takes Photoshop and some knowledge of what the camera saw to manipulate it and bring out the image that she really wanted. So at this point you've seen my attempt to rescue my friend's picture of her dog, but let me just do a demonstration of what my dog photography would look like in real life. What settings would I use? So the family took the dogs to a local park, and I took some pictures. And here's the first one that I want to show you. To take good dog photos, I think also for small children, get down really low onto the ground, get down onto their level so you see things from their point of view and you're not constantly looking down at them because you're above them. Really get down in the weeds and almost think that you're like shooting at their eye level or shooting up at them. In terms of composition, that's the way I look at it. This is a cute shot of my dog Artie, but I've made a small mistake here. So my shutter speed was 1/640th of a second. My f-stop was 2.8, which is really open, and my ISO was 400. I said earlier when I was looking at the Vegas shot that f3.2 was about as risky as I could get. I took a risk and went with f2.8, and it didn't really work out, and I'll show you what I mean. So here is a zoomed in image of that same shot, and you can see I'm slightly back focused here. I don't have enough depth of field. Remember all the depth of field stuff we talked about with aperture. My aperture is very wide open, which is nice to blow out the background, but I've the camera focused on the dog's harness. You can see the harness is in perfect focus, but the back of the dog is not in focus, and the front of the dog is not in focus. So we have that cute little face with the licking of the nose, and really, I've missed it. That shot's not as good as it could be because my depth of field was not forgiving enough to get enough of the dog into focus. So it's still not a terrible shot, but it's not perfect. It's not flawless. It's good enough. So I made some adjustments. So here's Artie again, and you can tell now I've changed my approach. I've doubled my ISO from 400 to 800, so that's double the amount of light going into the camera, and my f-stop is now at 4, so I have a greater depth of field. You can see there's a little bit of grass in front of the dog that's in focus, a little bit of the sidewalk behind the dog is in focus, and the whole dog is in focus. And then that also allows me to boost my shutter speed way up, because I boosted my ISO and I got all that light coming into the camera, and I'm still got a very wide open aperture. I can boost my shutter speed up to 1/2500th of a second, so the dog's kind of trotting here, but I don't have any motion blur. It's kind of a cool pose, with her paws kind of up, lifted off the ground, and you can see she's in the middle of action. But I decided I'd go with a fast shutter speed and just go ahead and boost my ISO up, and I don't think that it's too noisy of a composition. I showed you the extremities, the extremes of ISO. When you turn it up to 25,000 or whatever that was, it gets super noisy. But you can see that you can crank ISO up to 800 here, and this is a very acceptable shot in terms of that noise level, that grain. So again, to reiterate for the 1000th time in this video, why automatic mode would decide ISO always needs to be at 100, I couldn't tell you, because at ISO 800, we have a ton more light available to the camera, which gives me a lot more flexibility with my other settings, and I still have a very acceptable level of detail and not that much grain. Here's another shot of my other dog, Nala, and again, same settings. Shutter speed 1/2500th of a second, f4, so my background is blown out. You just kind of have, there's some water back there, there's some grass back there, but you're not really distracted by it. Your eye goes to the dog. It's ISO 800 again, which is a good balance of allowing light into the camera, but still having a good amount of detail. And I really like this shot because it really captures this dog's personality. That is, if you meet Nala, that is exactly what she will do. She will jump up and she will lick you. So that is that dog. I hope that this video has not been too long. I hope that it has given you some ideas and some understanding of how your camera works. As always, Google is your friend. YouTube is your friend. There are lots of people who will help you with your exact camera and your exact settings. This is hopefully the beginning of a longer journey, and the only thing I would like to add to that is that shooting, you already have your camera, you already have your memory card. Shooting your camera costs you nothing at this point. Shoot every day if you want to. It won't cost you any more to get those shots developed. We learn things best when we do them, so go out there and do. Take photos, take awesome photos, share them with your friends, and let them enjoy that journey with you, and I wish you all the very best in your photographic journey.